He had not expected to find anyone at the edge of town on Christmas Eve. The road was a ribbon of dark, flanked by fields silvered with frost. The town lights behind him were a handful of low, steady embers. Jackson Ryder kept his truck moving slowly, the heater hissing like a small animal, his hand on the wheel around a worn ring he'd stopped taking off years ago. The memory of Daniel came as a scent sometimes, the oil of an old paintbrush, a cup of coffee cooling on the easel. Tonight, the studio windows were dark, and the house quieter than it had a right to be for a man who had once been called everything from the boss to the quiet trouble, depending on who told the story. A shape at the roadside made him break. For a moment, he thought it was stray drift, a bundle of coats blown up and left there, but then a head lifted, thin, a beanie half melted with snow, someone looking down the highway as if he'd been waiting for a miracle. Jackson pulled over and killed the engine. The truck's hazard lights blinked orange into the night. He stepped out, boots crunching, and the cold punched up his face. The boy, young man, was small in a way that winter made worse, shoulders hunched, jacket zipped against a chill that ran deep enough to find the marrow. He had a backpack that looked light for carrying more than a few ruined shirts. When he looked up, his eyes were the color of the drained streetlight, startled and embarrassed at once. "Sir," the young man said. His voice came out like a question. "Sir, can I eat your leftovers?" Jackson blinked. The sentence should have been comic on paper, the way a request like that belongs to a diner or a bluff. But in the raw, it landed in Jackson's chest like a stone. Naked, small, hungry. Not a demand, not even a plea fully formed, just the hope of being allowed to take what someone else didn't want anymore. He recognized that note, the muffled politeness of someone taught to shrink. There was something in how the boy rolled his shoulders inward that opened a part of Jackson he'd kept closed since the funeral, the part that had held the clean edges of grief and grown hard around them. He thought of Daniel's laugh, of the last Christmas tree still standing in the corner with one string of lights half unwrapped, of a house that had become too quiet by degrees. Jackson crouched down so the boy didn't have to look up. "What's your name?" "Finn," he said. One syllable, an offering. He glanced toward the dark that led back to town like someone measuring the distance to a closed door. "You're not supposed to be out here tonight," Jackson said. It wasn't a scold, just a statement. He could have called the sheriff and made sure the boy was put somewhere safe for the night. He could have driven him to the county shelter and checked the logs later. He could have done 1,000 proper, careful things. But all of those were arrangements that had a way of stretching a long time before they did the simplest thing, giving someone a warm bowl. Finn shivered. His breath came like smoke. My dad." He stopped and swallowed. The name landed in the air like a stone thrown in a still pond. "Robert Holloway. We had a fight. I thought I could walk back, but the road..." He swallowed again. "I don't have any place to go." Jackson didn't think about the law or about forms. He thought about the night Daniel stopped coming home and how he'd left his cups on the sink like a map. He thought about the way grief had taught him to recognize the exact tilt of someone who had been taught to stand aside. He slid a hand into his pocket, felt the crumpled half-burned cigarette and a folded 20. He thought about the risks, Finn's age, the legalities, and he thought about a table in his house, its wood scarred by years of hands. "No," Jackson said finally, and his voice carried the kind of small authority that came from being used to people looking to you for an answer. "You don't eat leftovers on the road." Finn blinked as if the phrase had nothing to do with him. "No? No." Jackson rose and offered his hand. "You sit at the table." They both heard the weight of the words hang between them. Sit at the table. Simple, domestic, an act that folded someone into a life. It was not a charity line. It wasn't, "I will help you for now." It was an invitation and a claim. You belong in here. Finn's face crumpled then, for reasons Jackson couldn't name entirely. There was gratitude and shame braided together, and something like disbelief. "Are you serious? I can..." "Get in the truck," Jackson said. His voice left no room for negotiation. He tossed the key at the boy and watched him fumble it, the movements halting, almost reverent, like a man handling something he thought had to be earned. Finn climbed up into the warmth, and Jackson drove them back through the humming town lights. When they arrived, the house smelled like wood smoke and oil. Jackson carried his keys in a way that had once been a signal when he left the old life. Now they only unlocked a front door and a studio. He took Finn's backpack in one hand and pulled a thick blanket from the back of the truck. The back door groaned as they opened it. The kettle on the stove was a blackened soldier that had been less used this winter. Jackson set the blanket over the boy's shoulders and sent him near the stove light toward the warmth, and then turned to set a pot on the stove for stew. He found cups and bowls, bread wrapped in cloth in the larder, and in quiet domestic lynchings began to undo the ways the world had made Finn small. They ate at the table. It was the kind of meal that wasn't about taste so much as about heat and the grace of something solid filling an empty place. Finn ate slowly, like someone afraid to be greedy.
He apologized in half sentences between mouthfuls, for the trouble, for showing up, for not being more. Jackson listened and sometimes answered with small facts. This room had been painted by two of them. Daniel had left his coat on that peg. He told no long stories. He offered the steady presence that had been all that remained of many other lives he had touched. When Finn finally fell asleep on the couch, wrapped in that blanket, Jackson found himself sitting at the kitchen counter with his chin in his hands, staring at the steam rising from the dish he'd rinsed. He had not expected to take anyone in. He had not expected to feel the familiar ache tighten in his chest and then loosen, as if another person had stepped into a pattern that made sense of the rest. Before he could decide anything more complicated, there was a knock at the door. Sheriff Miller came in with a knock and boots that made a small, solid rhythm on Jackson's floor. Miller was pragmatic. He had been through the town's small tragedies and learned to bring thermos flasks and patience. He looked at Finn on the couch and then at Jackson, reading the evening like a map. "How'd you come across him?" Miller asked. He had questions that weren't meant to catch Jackson in a lie. He just wanted to know the facts so he could arrange the proper next steps. Jackson explained. "Found him on the highway. Said his name's Finn. Said he left Holloway's." Miller's face tightened. "Robert Holloway's boy? He used the last name like a thorn. You mean Holloway Sr. I ain't surprised." "Not yet," Jackson cut in. "Finn said he walked off. He had nowhere to go. I put him by the stove." Miller took a breath, looking at the boy as he slept, then out the window where the highway cut through darkness. "The shelter's over capacity, and with the weather it's tough," Miller said. "You sure you can?" "I can handle it tonight," Jackson said. He didn't promise months, but he didn't say no. Miller hesitated, the sheriff's duty against the man's private authority a small tension in the room. "I'll check in with social services in the morning, get him some intake forms or whatever. But if he's telling the truth about being turned out..." "Then that's on Holloway," Jackson finished. He didn't like the way the name sounded in his mouth, but it closed the sentence like a seal. Miller nodded. Before Miller left, he sat at the table for a moment, cup in his hands, and watched Jackson as if reading the man. "You know how people talk," he said, "about you." Jackson let out a small laugh that had no pride in it. "Let them. Just make sure Holloway knows where he is, Miller." Miller left with those practical things arranged, a number for the county caseworker, a promise to look into the father's whereabouts. Jackson sat back in the silence with the kettle cooling, looking at the art supplies on the workbench and at the name Finn that had begun to inhabit the air like a small trembling plant. They didn't talk in whole sentences at first. Finn woke and had the embarrassed ritual of dividing his story into manageable pieces. He said his father's name too casually, as if it were a wrung-out coat he'd been required to wear. Jackson listened without prying, letting Finn choose what to offer. The boy told how he'd come out months earlier and been met with a glare at first, then a series of small rejections that had stacked into a single act of exile. His father turned his keys into a hinge and pointed him outside. "Why didn't you call anyone?" Jackson asked at one point, because the question had been lodged inside him. Finn looked at him as if trying to estimate how safe the question would be. "Who would I call? I don't have..." He swallowed. "I had a scholarship letter, but no money. My friends... I thought I could go to the shelter, but I thought they'd..." He stopped. "I didn't want to be a burden." Jackson thought about the many people who had once known him as a kind of boss, some friendlier, some more afraid, how that life had taught him to read fear and to break it. He thought of Daniel's patient hands across painting canvases, the way he had loved people for their edges. He found himself answering Finn with an old, blunt truth. "Being hungry isn't a crime," he said. "Being young and wrong-footed doesn't mean you're a burden. It means you need a place to warm up." Finn's laugh was short and brittle. "You make it sound like it's that simple." "It's never that simple," Jackson said.
but start here. That night, he gave Finn the guest room and closed the door softly behind him. He left the light dim in the hallway, an old, small kindness. As Jackson moved around his kitchen, he found things he hadn't realized he kept because they held Daniel inside them. A folded scarf, a half-completed canvas with a broad, bright stroke of blue. For the first time in months, the house felt less like the storage of memory and more like it might take another life. Their days settled into a slow rhythm that winter, like a new refrain learned painfully until the fingers could find the notes without thinking. Finn learned where to find the coffee, how Jackson liked stew, how the stove coughed before it lit. Jackson learned how Finn laughed, a small exhalation that came when he painted, when he was allowed to make mistakes. Finn started spending afternoons in the studio, sitting in a thin shaft of light as if gravity liked him there. He picked up a brush and began with careful, hesitant strokes until the canvas answered back in color. There were practical complications. Social services called in, and a caseworker named Rana came through with forms and pamphlets and a kindness that included direct questions. Finn, at 21, was legally an adult and could refuse to take the shelter's offer or could accept it. He chose neither immediately.
He spoke about trying to go to art school, about saving money from odd jobs, about being afraid his father might come back to tell him he didn't belong anywhere. Jackson offered what he could without losing himself: a room, some groceries, a place to sleep. He didn't sign forms that would make him a guardian, he had no such right, but he used the one power he'd never given up, the power to insist. He made calls, quiet, efficient calls that hinted at a history of favors and old connections, but did not speak of threats. He called an old friend who was now an attorney and asked for help in advising Finn on his rights. He deposited a check in Finn's name for a summer program he'd found and put the details in a drawer to present when Finn was ready. Meanwhile, the town's small networks began to notice a boy in an old man's house. Some people shrugged and kept to their errands. Others dropped off food anonymously. Neighbors noticed Finn carrying canvases and asked him about supplies. Some lent paint. A professor at the local community college heard a rumor and offered Finn a spot in a workshop. The world did what a small town does best and worst, enacted curiosity, caution, compassion in equal measure. The father's absence was not a silence that stayed silent. Robert Holloway called first, his voice a slab of practiced anger. He demanded to know where his son was. Finn said on the phone that he was fine, and hung up, his hands shaking so hard he left the phone on the table. The next time Holloway came in person, he stood at the edge of Jackson's yard and yelled. Sheriff Miller came and talked to him, calm as someone who had handled men like him before. He told Holloway he couldn't force his son to return if Finn refused. Holloway's fury had the dull edges of someone who could not control what he wanted. When he threatened, Sheriff Miller stepped between the lines of what the law would allow and what the town's sense of safety demanded. He keeps showing up, Finn told Jackson one night, shoulders hunched against a new kind of cold, the one that comes from being stalked by a memory of where you were supposed to be safe. He says I'm a disgrace. He says I'll regret this. You won't be made small by his anger, Jackson said. He had learned the economy of certain sentences: short, strong, true. You are not his property. There were legal hearings, brief, bureaucratic meetings that felt like a door slamming and opening all at once. Holloway filed papers, made claims about economic dependency, sent a lawyer with clipped shoes and a tie that meant business. Jackson sat at the back of the county office, a quiet island in a sea of paperwork, and watched Finn speak for himself. There, shy and not yet steady, Finn said he wanted to be in art school, that he didn't want to return to a house full of a man's resentments. The judge listened and ruled in the ways the law allows for an adult. Finn had the right to decline contact. Holloway had the right to petition. A restraining order was considered because of repeated harassment. The sheriff's intervention grew firmer. When Holloway attempted to cross the line and show up at the house one night, drunk and belligerent, it was Miller who let him off the property, and it was Holloway who left with the weight of handcuffs that were more than tactical. They were a public ledger of his misjudgment. At no point did Jackson make a show of violence or vengeance. He used his resources the way a man who had once been called boss would, by calling in favors, by insisting that school records be secured, by buying paint for Finn's workshops and arranging for a lawyer who would take reduced fees because it was the right thing to do. He never threatened. He offered stability. If his past gave him any leverage, he used it to create safe circles, not to corral. The months that followed were not miraculous in the simplistic sense. There were mornings Finn didn't want to get out of bed, nightmares that left him gasping, and days of small triumphs that tasted sweeter than they had any right to. He found a rhythm with painting, long undercoats, bold strokes, a layer of light that had to be coaxed. The studio came alive. Paint dried on the floor where Daniel had once stepped, and Finn's canvases leaned against the wall like a new kind of furniture. Jackson found himself making tea and standing in the doorway more often than he expected, watching, learning how Finn's face softened when he was lost in work. There were therapy sessions, 2 steps toward the future. Finn met a counselor at the community center who specialized in helping LGBTQ+ young adults navigate family trauma and new independence. Jackson, too, sat in a chair with a thoughtful woman who asked him questions about grief he'd avoided because they ached. He kept Daniel's memory intact. He kept a chair at the table as if it had been reserved. But he also learned how to make room for someone who might not replace Daniel, but might, over time, share the space with him.
Jackson sat cross-legged on a chair and read, the lamp throwing a small ring of light. He would correct Finn gently when he tilted the jaw wrong or overdid a shadow. Finn corrected Jackson's reading aloud with a smile. "You don't always have to be the boss in a painting," Finn said once without looking up, and Jackson felt the line go through him like a soft blade. He had been the boss in some people's stories, a label that had meant different things. Here, under the lamp's warm eye, it lost its bite and became simply a fact of past life, a way of being that could be repurposed into care. As spring thinned into a wet green light, Finn received a letter of acceptance to a summer program at a state art school 3 hours away. The scholarship would cover part of the cost. He wanted to go. It was the first time he had spoken a future beyond the walls of Jackson's kitchen out loud. The announcement made both of them tremble, Finn at the idea of leaving the place he'd learned to be warm, and Jackson at the thought of the house echoing more again. But the trembling was different now, threaded with pride instead of fear. "You should go," Jackson said. He wrapped his hands around Finn's shoulders as if to anchor him. "You have to go." "But what if," Finn started. Then he stopped, looking at the paint in his hands that had become his argument. "You'll come back," Jackson said. "And when you come back, we'll be exactly where we are." He meant it. Somehow permanence had become less of a demand for a single kind of relationship, and more of a promise of options. Finn could leave and return as he pleased. The table would still exist. They spent the last night before Finn left painting a small canvas together in the kitchen, an informal ritual. Finn painted a narrow strip of the table's weathered wood. Jackson painted the kettle steaming at the corner. They laughed at small mistakes and didn't mind the splay of color that glowed on the table leg. Finn packed in the morning with an old duffel and a stack of canvases. He kissed Jackson's cheek at the threshold, the kind of kiss that maps familiarity rather than passion, and climbed into his car. Jackson watched him go until the taillights became 2 small, stubborn points on the road. Weeks between visits were a new shape in the house. Jackson filled them with small acts. Laundry left with a faint smell of Finn's paint, food warmed on the stove, a postcard that came sometimes and sat on the counter. He made the drive to the school when he could and sat in the back of a small auditorium listening to Finn talk about color and space as if he had always been an adult. The townspeople changed the way they looked at Finn. They introduced him to other artists, to a professor who offered him a part-time job helping paint community spaces. He was no longer the boy on the road. He was an artist in motion. The knots of the past were never untied cleanly.
Holloway continued to fume and, for a while, wrote letters and made calls. He showed up once at the school to cause a fuss and was escorted away. Finn filled out forms to protect himself, to get a restraining order, to secure his own mailbox and a small cheap lock on his storage unit. Jackson sat in those meetings and learned the legal vocabulary enough to be useful. One winter, nearly a year after they had first met, Finn returned for the holidays. The house smelled like yeast and oranges and everything in the world that had to do with ordinary celebration. The tree, small, almost comically thumbed in the corner, was decorated with things Finn had painted and with a bright, thin ribbon. It felt like a miracle that had been earned in the slow currency of days. That evening, after the plates had been cleared and the kettle was humming, Jackson took a breath large enough to hold in his chest. He thought about the first night, the hazard lights, the single sentence that had changed 2 lives. He thought of Daniel again, with his gentle criticism, and the way he'd always left space for someone else's hand on the brush. He thought of all the small acts that had stitched them together, the neighbor who shared a jar of jam, the sheriff who had called quietly to check, the lawyer who had waived his fee. He sat at the head of the table and looked at Finn. The boy had grown, no longer boyish, but there was still a youthfulness around his eyes that had been softened into something open. Finn put his hands on the table like a prayer, like a claim. "You can stay," Jackson said. His voice had the flat force of a man who had been spared a kind of hardness by being given the chance to be soft. "You don't have to leave, Finn." Finn's face changed. A careful delight uncoiled into something more honest, a blooming that made Jackson's throat tighten. He opened his mouth to say something, and then closed it because whatever he said would not be enough. Jackson reached across and placed his hand over Finn's. "You sit at the table," he said. He said it the way he'd said it the first night, both a boundary and an inclusion. The world had altered, and that sentence no longer hung as a single act of immediate rescue, but as the stitching of a life. Food, rest, voice, belonging. It was an offer of permanence. It was not an erasure of the past, not a promise that pain would be gone, but a calm line that marked the place Finn could come to again and again. Finn's eyes filled. He laughed, a small, honest thing, and then he did what he'd done in the studio 1,000 times. He painted an answer. He had been working on a canvas for weeks, stealing minutes in the morning, in the evening, in those small cracks of time when Jackson was out buying groceries or fixing the porch light. It had been a private thing until he could make it public. He stood, switched on a lamp, and carried the canvas to the table. Jackson took it as Finn set it down, like the presentation of a truth. The painting was of him, of Jackson, captured not as the rumor of a boss or the outline of a past, but in the way Finn saw him, an ordinary man with a hard hand and a soft face, a man who had built a table and then invited someone to sit. Finn had painted the studio's light the way it hit Jackson's cheekbone, had painted the weathered ring on his finger and the kettle at the corner. The background was an array of blues that Daniel might have liked, a continuity buried in color rather than claim. Jackson set his mouth in a line he used whenever something moved him too much for words. He turned the painting slightly and then turned back to Finn, to his face, to that proof of living. "You didn't have to," Jackson said. "I wanted to," Finn said, voice gone thin. They both sat at the table with the painting between them. It felt like an altar and a table both. It felt like proof that 2 lives could find a way to fold into one room and leave it fuller for the act. In the weeks that followed, they did what people who have been given shelter sometimes do. They turned gratitude outward. Finn suggested they do something practical for those who might stand on the road one night and ask for a bowl. They assembled a box, a weatherproof little chest, filled with gloves, blankets, canned food, a few disposable heat packs, and a list of phone numbers for local shelters and support services. It was not a gesture grand enough to solve structural problems, but it was immediate and it was considerate. They bolted it to a post near the lane where Jackson had first found Finn, and wrote on the underside in careful white paint, "You're not on that road anymore." They started a small fundraiser at the town's community center, a modest exhibit of Finn's work, and a bake sale run by neighbors, and set up a small pot where people could donate money for other boxes and supplies. They used Jackson's old network, people who had once done deals and favors and now lent their skills for free, to arrange low-cost art supplies for workshop kids, to provide transportation to school, to find a cheap storage space for canvases. The acts were small, shared, human. Months accumulated, and the house hummed with life. Finn taught a workshop for teens at the community college on making art with found materials. Jackson helped, handing out brushes and listening as kids talked about the ways they navigated their own fractured homes. The sheriff stopped by sometimes and sat in the kitchen for coffee. The attorney recommended another funding source.
The professor curated a small show in which Finn's portrait of Jackson was included as the centerpiece. People who had only had rumor to go on found the man at the table and sat down. There were tender, awkward moments, affection that bent toward more than friendship and then pulled back because they both cherished the slower pace.
There were nights of conversation that sifted through the bones of the past. Jackson speaking of Daniel in a voice that might have broken but didn't. Finn sharing memories of a childhood that had been half warmed and half denied. There was an intimacy that grew not from the quick spark of romance, but the steady piling on of small trusts, remembering how someone liked their coffee, bringing back a scarf, forgiving a misstep. On the anniversary of the night they'd met, Jackson and Finn stood at the roadside where the box had been installed. The town had hung lights on the trees. Finn touched the wooden post like a blessing, and then drove jars of supplies down with Jackson in the truck, both of them quiet in a way that had roots. They'd begun to measure time differently, no longer by the years since a funeral, but by the years since a table had been offered. One evening, sitting at the table with 2 steaming cups between them, Finn asked a question that had been in him for a long time. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Taking me in, I mean. Do you ever find it too much?" Jackson looked out the window at the light of the town, and then down at Finn's paint-splattered sweater. He thought about the months of small work, making stew, making calls, going to meetings, sitting through nightmares, watching a young man learn how to hold a brush as if it were a key. He thought of the quiet weight of Daniel's things, and how that weight had been changed by a second presence, until it was no longer a load, but a shelf. "No," he said simply, "I don't regret it. It hurt to lose Daniel, and some things will always be hollow, but you," he paused, searching for a phrasing that didn't sound like a speech, "you made the silence a room again." Finn's gaze went to the painting on the wall, the one he'd given Jackson. "I thought maybe you'd prefer the quiet," he said. "I didn't want to take that." "You didn't take it," Jackson told him. "You added to it." They sat in the plain warmth of the kitchen and drank their coffee. Outside, a gust rattled the eaves and then moved on. Inside, the lamp hummed and the kettle cooled. They had no illusions about a perfect cure. Finn still had hard days. Jackson still wandered sometimes into rooms where Daniel scent remained. But they had each other, and that steadiness had a gravity all its own. Near the end, as the story of them had seeped into other people's lives, people asked Jackson about his old reputation. He let them say the words, Don Ryder, boss, whispers of past corners, but he didn't let them define the present. His past had the texture of rumor. He used it when it helped, and he refused it when it harmed. He had been a man who once gained authority in blunt ways. Now he used that same persistence to stand between a boy and the cold. Their small work of giving back grew in its humble way. The roadside box multiplied in another town when a neighbor asked for plans. Finn taught a workshop for teens that had been run by the college's outreach program and found again and again kids who carried little packages of shame. He taught them to make color with whatever they could find, to turn a scar into a line and a memory into paint. The town learned a slow lesson in the economy of care, that a bowl and a chair and a patient ear could do more than assume pity and more than sermon. They never made a scene of violence to underline their story. They didn't need to. The work was to show up. Finn insisted on agency. He applied to more programs. He found a part-time job teaching art. He paid Jackson back in small ways: a repaired lamp, a meal cooked, a framed painting placed proudly in the living room. Jackson learned to say the words he meant without armor. He learned that to open a table was not to betray a memory, but to honor it. On a warm evening in late summer, when the lights slanted like honey across the yard, Finn and Jackson sat at the table outside with a small group of neighbors. Children ran around the lawn with stolen paintbrushes. Someone strummed a guitar. They had a small raffle to raise funds for more boxes. Under the low-slung sky, Jackson looked over at Finn and thought of that first night. Hazard lights, the roadside, the small ask. He heard again the phrase he'd used then. You sit at the table. Tonight it had become a rhythm, repeated softly in the town. Finn rose and approached Jackson with something small and carefully wrapped.
He set it down and then stepped back, face lit with the same quiet nerve he had when he painted. "For the table," he said. Jackson unwrapped a small wooden box. Inside, a slip of paper read, "When you're ready, sit." He smiled and felt something inside him loosen into a gratefulness that had no need to be loud. The box had been carved by one of Finn's students. The handwriting was messy and furious in the best way. They both knew that lives were never finally sewn. They would always fray at corners and need mending. But they had learned to mend in honest ways, through art, through law when needed, through small acts of hospitality and stubborn care. They had held each other's grief and did not pretend it had been wholly healed. They had instead learned how to live with it in a house that now had room for more than memory. If this story moved you, consider liking and subscribing to help more stories like this reach people. That winter, as the town readied its lights again, Jackson and Finn installed another box, not the roadside one, but a small emergency supply chest in the lobby of the community center, stocked with resources for anyone who needed a place to call. Finn hung a painting above it, an image of a table of 2 cups, one steaming and one cooling, and the words painted lightly across the bottom, "You're not on that road anymore."
They continued to live quietly in their household, paintings drying in corners, a kettle always half full, an open seat at the end of the table. People came by, a young man who had once been homeless, a woman from the shelter with her baby, and they were offered soup, a place to charge a phone, a listening ear. Finn's art found walls outside the town, and when he returned with a new piece, the house felt larger, as if the world had expanded to accept a quiet generosity. Years later, long enough that the edges of grief had softened but not gone, they still kept one ritual. On the anniversary of that first night they met, they drove out to the place where the highway cut the field and stood under the same sky. They bolted a small plaque to the post that held the original box. On it, they had carved a phrase that held everything in its ordinary honesty. Sit, eat, stay. It was a tiny manifesto. Robert Holloway remained in town, but receded to the margins, mostly his own business.